One of the main tasks I have taken upon myself recently at this new job, being the most experienced UI front end person there, which is kind of a scary thought at the same time, but I'm working on kind of consolidating the styles and designs around some of the different products and other applications we have moving forward, getting getting them in better position to have more of a unified UI experience, not even necessarily between applications, but within a certain specific application itself on just consistency of visual cues, like primary buttons all having the same color and size and hover effect, and secondary actions, primary links, etc. And to start that out, kind of working through setting up a little design system or guidelines for it. And that's really where I think a lot of CSS needs to start out with, is some basic definitions, the fundamentals of what the rules are that are going to be pretty unique for the site overall. Things that are like your font, so knowing what the typeface is you're going to use for your header versus your body if you want to use a different type space, what sizing scale you're going to have for the H1 versus an H2, H3, all the way down to your main body copy, any kind of sizing there. Some of the definitions you want to have too along that sizing, that ways to spice up a style is using just bold or emphasis or an underline instead of making text bigger or a different color. So really starting off the bat, having those things defined so that when a developer is working on the application, either creating a new page, a new feature component of the application, there aren't as many decisions made on the fly that contributes to the entropy over time of either a degraded UI experience because you have a new color introduced for the border here that it looks like a slightly similar gray to somewhere else, but because those definitions weren't established at the beginning and the developer may not have checked the design tools to see what other colors there are already there, then you've got that degradation and consistency. And then that also means that it would also affect the maintainability, because as you work towards a more unified design in the future, now you've got other different colors to kind of look for. An example right now, the application I'm working on, taking an inventory of all the colors, is I've come across roughly 30. I haven't done a full count because some of them were just using the CSS color name like white and then using the hex color elsewhere of just the FFF or even all 6 Fs. And then I've seen some RGB usage across too. But that's then another area that contributes to difficulty of maintainability, that even though visually it may be the same color, it's still defined differently. And when there needs to be a change to the style, say a designer wants to spice things up a little bit and do an off-white, now you can't just have one single search and replace. You have to check multiple areas again. And one thing I've come across throughout this is we're using Angular as our main front end framework, and their style guide has a neat little acronym called LIFT to follow along for some of the principles of designing components. And I've been kind of thinking of ways to make that more of a style CSS centric angle for it. And the first part of lift is to locate the code quickly. You want to be able to quickly bounce back between your HTML and your CSS and know either when you're looking in the HTML to find out where all the style definitions are for all the classes or any of the selectors that may be applying to this element, and then vice versa. Maybe you're starting out in the CSS and you want to see all areas in the HTML where these styles are actually being utilized, so then you would know what pages to load up in a testing environment in order to view, do image capture, whatever kind of tooling you have to verify that one, everything is the right color and styles they should be, and two, that they actually look well together. And so to help locate code around is really to prioritize using class names for your selectors, just instead of plain elements, or at least having a combination of class selectors with the elements. Otherwise, when you're using straight up elements themselves, it's not something that is unique to your site or your setup. And so you're going to have multiple areas found by just using normal HTML elements. And to identify things at a glance is when you're building out your CSS to have related selectors together. So if you have a, for example, a list item of a specific type of list, then you want some of that surrounding outside style definitions together with the list items, and to try to avoid some of the descending specificity for it. So really you start out with your most specific cases, and I believe that there's actually a lint rule for that I'll pull up real quick to make sure I am getting that information correct on what they refer to for descending specificity. And to give a good example of that, yeah, so try avoiding selectors of lower specificity and overriding selectors higher. So really you want to start with the general case and work more towards the specific case. And that helps apply then to for being able to identify at a glance, so you know what is at the beginning affecting your style of certain definitions overall. And then as you scroll down through the source, you can see how it gets progressively enhanced or changed depending on different contexts. So the third part of the lift method to keeping a flat structure is to minimize the usage of selector combinations. So either enforcing a selector to be two classes together, or a class plus a pseudo selector, or an attribute selector, or an ID, that there are plenty of cases where you're not going to be able to define easily and reusably an entire site based on just single class name selectors. You're going to run into a lot of, well, I mean, you could, but now you're getting a lot of crazy named classes that are going to get real long and be difficult to either locate quickly or identify at a glance. So when working on your selectors, combining things together, try to keep it as minimal as possible. And if you're using a preprocessor, that's kind of what nesting helps in your organization to do, is those selector combinations. And one of the general rules in basic lint is to keep it at like no more than three deep if you can. And I don't know if the lint rules offhand, if they apply to some of the pseudo selectors like hover or active or focus if you're trying to target a link or a button. And I don't really count those pseudo selectors as part of that nesting depth. And then the last part of the lift method is to try to be dry, and that is still one area here that I'm kind of trying to figure out how to apply for CSS without getting too redundant and just repeating everything correctly, because one of the ways to keep dry with CSS is having specific applicable component classes, and that really helps a lot with locating code quickly or identifying at a glance. So it's one of those aspects of really to try to think of how to apply and describe it without and presenting a little bit of new information without repeating everything else. And then just beyond the lift method for things that when it comes to spacing specifically for CSS, so your margin, your padding and all that, is to keep the box model in mind. And if I pull up what the Mozilla Developer Network has for the box model on some of the different parts for it, we have down here the content box, the padding box, border box, and a margin box. And when it comes to the margin is really a selector itself. I try to avoid declaring anything on top of that because I try to view all of my components as if they are in a vacuum, kind of in and of themselves. So a margin is not needed on an item if you are not placing it around any other elements. So that really then becomes a responsibility of the parent and the selectors off of that to then define that what the margin and spacing around each separate child should be. And that helps further along to that if you have certain reusable components, because they are not defining that margin themselves, there is less override you have to do to make them fit nicely with any other sibling elements in the different contexts. And some of the keywords and pseudo selectors that I've been seeing more underutilized are like the inherit keyword. And that kind of goes a bit together too with the not. I have seen in plenty of cases for button usages where a hover color is defined. So you have that nice hover focus for it. But then there's still the disabled case to take care of, and either through using or avoiding the usage of the not pseudo selector or not using the inherit keyword for the colors, it's redefining that foreground or background color in that disabled hover or focus needlessly. And so if that base color changes for the button, any of those aspects you still want to preserve between the normal state and the disabled state. If you are repeating them again, any changes in the future, that's another spot where you would have to repeat those definitions again. So if you were using inherent keyword or possibly in combination with the not pseudo selector, it helps kind of simplify those extra definitions and keep some of those color relationships together so that as you make changes, they get reflected accordingly. And then current color is actually the one I learned the most recently that actually does have some fairly good browser support. And what it does is whatever you have defined for the color property, what is used for the color property, then current color will be say use that, so you don't have to, in cases where I've seen like the font color and the border color would be the exact same, instead of redefining the hex variable or like a preprocessor variable or a hex code or something, you can just use current color. And then again, you now have only one spot to change things and it gets reflected everywhere. So it helps keep that relationship for you and takes out some of that manual legwork. And at the bottom here, I have a list of resources. There's a GitHub page here that has a real large in-depth reading list of of all the different kind of methods for creating scalable or maintainable CSS, really going into some of the giant principles like the atomic design using BEM, block element modifier style. There's see if I can see it on this list. Yeah, object-oriented CSS, things like that. And then some of the information that has helped me from the end to end around working with spacing in the box model. And as I've been working through building this design system, or at least style guidelines for work, UXPin has had a good series of blogs for building a design system that goes really in depth on how important it is to go through the typographic scale, the colors, just defining your basic building blocks from the start so that it's not quite as wild, wild west as new things get added in or as things get changed. And then the final resource here, Typescale, is pretty cool. I never thought of looking at a visual type scale, and they have it defined in some musical terms like the minor second, major third. You got the golden ratio, and so you can preview it with different fonts and weights and seeing your base size and looking at how that typographic scale works. And that's mainly it.
Question for you about
Yeah.
when you start going beyond the building blocks of the foundation, your common patterns for how your style, right? You start getting into specific pages. I feel like that pretty quickly does turn into a wild west. And just wonder if you have any rules of thumb or general guidelines that can help when you got page A and it needs some very specific things, and page B needs some other specific things, and then we just end up with a lot of rules that are just like hard coded or specified for page A and rules specified for page B. Is that just the nature of it, or any suggestions?
I would utilize a tool kind of like Storybook, potentially, even if not that in depth, as you start to build up some of the components and having that library of pieces within the application to be able to view them in isolation of the page, be able to work with the different dynamic values that are there, and just having, and that allows developers to, or designers to see what that HTML and styling would actually be. That's really kind of would be my suggestion for, as those building blocks come out, is that would be the next step to evolve. And where Bootstrap Material UI, they have that component library of different things where that's kind of the next step off of these basic building blocks to then keep track of those and their usage. All right, any other questions? Now quickly add storybook for a nice little resource here on this. Let's list of notes. All right. Thanks everyone who came by to listen to my little spiel and about just CSS and styling from more of a developer's perspective and not a designer.